Hello, hello. So how many people do we have in the room? Okay, well, welcome everybody, those of you that are at 1 sharp. My name is Hugo Herrera, and today we are going to be talking about using system dynamics to explore complex social problems. So welcome to this webinar Wednesday. It's part of the series of webinars that the OR Society has been organizing since coronavirus started. And well, we were just discussing that it's a very nice idea and a good way to keep in touch and keep sharing our knowledge with the community. So I will probably just wait a little bit to see if more people join us in case that they're having some troubles to connect or so. Meanwhile, I can talk a bit about myself. So I am a system dynamics practitioner. I'm a modeler. I did studies in operational research, but I have focused a lot on system dynamics in the past probably 7 to 10 years. I have been using it in public sector, private sector, and a variety of topics from managing radioactive waste to uh, environmental issues or environmental problems in West Africa, dealing with the food systems and so on and so forth. So I hope that this webinar is going to be useful for all of you and you're going to get something interesting out of it. I have kindly asked Olga Tolmachova to be the co-chair this afternoon so that she can help me to keep an eye on the chat and keep an eye on the questions. So thanks, Olga, for agreeing to do that. So I will probably pass it to her for some housekeeping.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I would like to go over a few housekeeping points with you before we start. First of all, we recommend that you reduce the video box of your Zoom to only one video slot so that you could position it in the right-hand corner of the slides so you don't miss out on any information that is presented on the slides. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session. And if you have a question for that, please type it in the Q&A function that you could see a button for in the bottom of the Zoom. You also can vote for the questions that you like and upweight them. So during the Q&A session, we will start with the most popular questions and go further as time allows us. During the presentation, we will also have 3 poll questions. Please give us your answers when those come up on your screen. But be mindful that if you're joining us today via browser and not via the Zoom application, you unfortunately won't be able to participate in the polls. There will be a video of this webinar available on the OR website, and it also will be sent to you via email by Friday. And we're also making a survey at the end of it, which will be emailed to you as well to see how well we did. So please give us your feedback. Would much appreciate that. I think that is all for the housekeeping of today. So let us begin the presentation. Hugo, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. So for those that just joined us, my name is Hugo Herrera, and today we will be talking about using system dynamics to explore complex social problems. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat. Olga and Geraldine will be keeping an eye on it. And also if you have more technical questions or points that you want to raise, they're also going to be keeping an eye on it, and hopefully they will be able to help you with that. So without more, I am going to start with the presentation, and this is a quick overview of what are we going to discuss today. First, we will briefly introduce what are the aims of this webinar, or what I would like you to get out of it, hopefully aligns with your expectations. Then we will talk a little bit about the problems of the public policy public policy for social problems. Then we'll have a very quick introduction to system dynamics. System dynamics is a complex method, so by no means I'm trying to cover it fully today, but hopefully this introduction will give you a good flavor of what it is and how does it work, and specifically how can we use it to tackle problems, social problems and we will have an example afterwards where I will be discussing I think a quite well-known case study that happened in the US. And at the end, I will be sharing some interesting resources in case that you find system dynamics something worthwhile or some method that you would like to explore more. Hopefully this will help you. So as Olga mentioned, we have some pool questions for today. So Olga, if you could launch the first question, I will be interested to know what is your background. So have you ever done some system dynamics modeling or systems modeling on some sort? So if you can answer that. Okay, well, it seems that so far it seems that we have a mixed group, and that's quite good. So it seems like interesting. Now half and half of you have some previous experience or some previous contact with system dynamics. Oh, literally half and half. That's surprising. And the other half hasn't. So like you probably know, remember from the banner for this webinar, I mentioned that it is not necessary to have a background in system dynamics. We will be covering some of the main concepts and some of the main a quick introduction of how system dynamics works. If you have already some contact with system dynamics, hopefully this will be a good refreshing of what you already know and maybe learn a bit of from a different perspective. So we will close that and we will start with the presentation. So the aims of today is first to introduce you to system dynamic modeling and analysis method, especially for those of you that haven't heard about it or haven't seen it before. Hopefully this is going to be a good introduction for you to grasp some of the concepts. Then I would like to discuss how system dynamics can be used in the policymaking world. So really in terms of practitioners to analyze complex complex social issues. Please note that I'm saying that is to analyze complex social issues, not pretending that we will manage to find answers or definite answers to some of them. But hopefully you will see that system dynamics and other operational research methods can be very helpful to understand a bit of what's going on and try to find good solutions for it. And finally, I will show an example of how system dynamics have been used, and hopefully this will give you some inspiration for other projects or other problems that you would like to tackle on your own or things that you are working now, and will give you an idea of how potentially you can use system dynamics in your own daily work or in your own research. So let's go for question number 2. And question number 2 is related to public policy. So which one do you think is the major challenge for implementing solution to complex problems? So if you answer that, I think it will give us an idea of what is your perception, because we just after the pool, we will start to talking about the problems of public policy to tackle complex issues, and particularly social complex issues. It seems that so far most of you think that is that the need to persuade different stakeholders, probably followed by the need to experiment and the cost of experimenting. And I think definitely the second one, the need to experiment and the cost of experimenting, is a very interesting one. It is very difficult to get data when we're talking about social problems, at least reliable data, at least that you do very extensive research. You have to interview lots of people and you need to understand how individuals make decisions. And that is one of the challenges when you're trying to build models or when you're trying to use other operational research methods to tackle this kind of problems. So we will briefly touch on that, how system dynamics might be an alternative. So thank you very much. Seems that most of you agree that it's about persuading different stakeholders. But yeah, I think the other 2 points are also interesting: the policy resistance from the government and the overconfident policymakers. So these two probably are more related to people and how people behave than the system itself. So moving on, we will quickly discuss about these problems of public policy for social problems. So what are the problems that public policy encounters when trying to address these social problems? And I am going to start by defining social problem. So well, we are trying to put some boundaries on this for this webinar. A social problem is any condition or behavior that has negative consequences for a large number of people, and that is generally recognized as a condition or behavior that needs to be addressed, something needs to be changed. So we can be talking about drugs, crime related, we can be talking about poverty, we can be talking about people in need that is not able to access some services, or like education or health. So all those kind of problems, we will include them in this category of social problems. And the reason why we mix them together is because they have very specific characteristics that make them very difficult to be tackled by public policy. So these issues or these characteristics that make it so difficult to tackle social problems is first that you need to persuade different stakeholders. So like you pointed out in the pool, one of the issues is that you need to talk to different people that have different views, different stakeholder groups that have different interests in the problem. And unfortunately, solutions are not likely to be good for everybody. They are going probably to be better for a group than for the other one. Or in some cases, if groups have competing objectives, you might even see that one of the groups is going to be, the policy is not going to be favorable for some of these stakeholder groups. So this is a very important point, because you need to negotiate or to find a compromise to get stakeholders to agree on something. Otherwise, a small group of stakeholders might oppose to the policy, or some or they might lobby for the policy not to be implemented. You could see these differences across regions, or you could see these differences across different levels between community level and central government, or you could see these differences even among the same community, where some group of stakeholders might favor some particular policy, but the other ones might perceive it as a disadvantage for them for different reasons. The second reason is policy resistance from the environment, or policy resistance from the system itself. So one characteristic of social problems is that they are complex, and they usually involve interconnection of many different elements within the system, many different components of the system interconnected with each other. And when these complexities overlook, policy actions might trigger feedback from the system that undermines the policy and at times even exacerbates the original problem. And we will be talking, as 50% of you might imagine from knowing system dynamics, we will be talking a lot about feedbacks and feedback loops today. And these feedbacks are particularly important because, as we will see this afternoon, they can undermine the effect of the policy or even result in unintended consequences. An example that we will explore in more detail later is, for example, when police forces are deployed to control the illegal drug market. So the drug supply decreases, this leads to higher prices, and the higher prices means that more individuals might feel that it's worthwhile to take the risk of getting into this activity, or just the revenue might push them into expand their operations, and that leads to a number of dealers increasing and undermines the original policy. And we see examples of this, for example, in Mexico, where the government tried to crack down with the drug dealers, and by doing that, they exacerbated the number of drug dealers and also the violence that was accompanying these groups. So it is not easy. It's not always as easy as it might be. So the policy resistance from the environment and this complexity is another big challenge. And the third one, an interesting one, is the overconfident policymakers. And research in the psychology field shows that the more difficult the question, we tend to be more confident, or we tend to be more, we're more confident on the answer. We feel often more sure that the answer that we're picking is the right one, just because the problem is too complex and too messy, and that is sometimes difficult to consider alternatives, difficult to consider what could be potentially different, or what could be the unintended consequences. So often policymakers make the same mistake, and they are overconfident about a particular policy that they want to implement, and they overlook the facts and the information that is presented in front of them. And one of the reasons why they might be overconfident is might be also because ideological beliefs, or because it is a particular solution fits whether with their own paradigm, without considering the details of the implementation on and the details of how this solution is going to be implemented in the system. So if we will, as in the operational research field, if we want to work with these kind of problems, if we want to be helpful to decision makers and support them, I think, and the literature support this, I think we need tools that help us to communicate and negotiate, as you were talking, you were saying at the beginning, in the pool, where negotiating with stakeholder is critical. So we need something that helps us to negotiate. We cannot rely on black and white answers, but we probably need tools that help us to explore different scenarios, and also that make evident what are the trade-offs and the consequences for different groups. So we cannot focus, for example, only in one single variable, but we probably need to look a bit wider picture and see what is going to be the effect of this policy in different variables that are important for different groups. Second, we need something that helps us to assess complexity, particularly dynamic complexity. Several methods in the operational research field that can be helpful for that. System dynamics is one of them, but obviously we have agent-based modeling as well. Discrete event simulation as well can be helpful. So we need a tool that helps us to understand dynamic complexity, how the system is adapting over time. So we cannot just extrapolate the behavior that we see today to the future, but we need to see how the system adapts, how the system change as a result of introducing a policy, and how this change in the system affects potentially the system's behavior. And finally, we need to provide something that's transparent and factual based to advise the policymakers. So we were talking about this overconfident policymaker in some point, and if he or she is very confident that he knows what or she knows what is the right answer, it might be difficult to prove them wrong. So you need something that they can understand and that they can relate to, and we have very good tools for do that. But we also should work in the way that we present the results so that they are easy accessible to those policymakers probably not familiar with modeling or not very technical. We will go to pool question number 3. So if Olga could pull it up. So what I imagine that most of you have experience modeling or building models, or have been on the other end receiving models. So which kind of model would you trust more? These more aggregated models that you can really understand, or those ones that are very large and only fully understood by experts? Well, it seems that we have a 80-20 split between the answers so far. And please be aware there is not right answer. I think both models are useful, and both models fulfill a specific purpose. And I think when you are talking to policymakers, you could use either of these type of models to communicate your results. And I particularly like these more aggregated models, but I also know that when you need to dig into the detail, you can use probably something more comprehensive and something more that breaks down. System dynamics usually fits better with the second one. You can build complex and very large models, but I would say they get very messy. So probably I will stick to the simple and small. So why system dynamics? Why system dynamics could be one of the potential tools to address these issues that we have with social problems? Well, the first one is that it's simple and transparent. You will see, for those of you that are not familiar with it, it's quite easy to follow. It's a very graphical. and it really helps you to grasp what are the dynamics of the system going on. Obviously, it's focused on complexity and dynamic complexity and feedback loops and develop of the system over time. So that's good for assessing complexity. And finally, is aggregated and related to the question in the pool. I think probably this is the place to start when you are addressing a social problem. As we discussed, or as I mentioned at the beginning, it is difficult when you need to collect a lot of data and try to understand a lot about individual behaviors. So the fact that system dynamics aggregate them, it makes it easier to deal with the data issue. You need less data and you don't need to dig too much into the detail. And the model is still valid and provides a very interesting insights. So with that more, we are going to do a quick introduction to system dynamics. System dynamics is a modeling method focused on studying how outcomes of the system are driven by its own internal mechanism. I think that is the key definition of system dynamics. It really focuses on how the structure or how the feedback loop relationships in the system are the ones that are driving the behaviors and try to minimize the effect of exogenous variables or things that are out of the control of the model itself. And the reason for that is because we want to understand how, by introducing a change in the system adapts and evolves rather than just extrapolate the current behavior. So we can understand how these feedback loops relationships or these circular relationships have an impact. The focus of system dynamics is on understanding causes, so understanding what's driving the behavior rather than try to make a very accurate prediction. So keep it in mind. If you're looking for something that's very precise, probably system dynamics will be very difficult to be calibrated to that point. But if you are trying to understand what is the main mechanisms that are driving that response, system dynamics is, I think, an ideal method to do so. And the other characteristic of system dynamics is time. So problems in which time is an important factor are relevant for system dynamics. This is because, again, system dynamics focuses on how the system is changing over time as a result that, of something that happened at the beginning as a result of the initial conditions. And it explores how the system could evolve in the future. So if we want to understand a problem, why things have developed in a certain way in the past, and we want to explore how things could develop in the future, system dynamics is a great tool. I'm not going to claim that it's the only one. For sure, there are other methods as well. But if you don't have a problem that is focusing on this developing over time, I don't think system dynamics is the right tool for you. Probably you need to look into any of the other interesting and very good modeling approaches that we have in the Operational Research Society. Basically, talking about this developing over time, basically system dynamics and the dynamics of system dynamics is this behavior of the system, a particular function, how one of these functions is going to behave over time. And here you see 6 very generic behaviors of basic dynamics that you can see in many systems. And these behaviors are produced by very simple structures and archetypes that have been identified in system dynamics field. And although they are very simple, they just by themselves are very useful and can give you an indication for already many problems. For example, oscillations, typical of markets behavior. For example, we have been talking a lot about exponential growth in the past couple of weeks and how the number of people infected by the pandemic was growing exponentially rather than linearly. But when you combine all of these small dynamics, you will see that you can reproduce and understand very interesting behaviors, way more complex than the ones shown here. Understanding a bit of the nomenclature of system dynamics and how does it work, it's probably similar to other causal word and arrow methods that the that are out there, like cognitive mapping or SODA or some of those other methods, you have a variable that is represented by a word or by a couple of words, and the arrows represent causality. So you can see that, for example, hunger cost is a cost of eating. So the more hungry I am, the more I eat. We usually indicate the polarity by this plus or minus with a plus indicating that the variables move in the same direction. So the more hungry I am, the more I eat. And the minus indicating that I move in the opposite direction. So the more I eat, the less hungry I am. So this is relatively simple. And you see this is already a feedback loop. The loops could be either reinforcing loops, so the more I have, the more I get, or they could be balancing loops, like the one here in our example. The more I have, the less I need. So the more I eat, the less hungry I am, therefore the less food I need to eat next time. The other important nomenclature of system dynamics, and here we are trying to touch very broadly how the models are built, is stock and flows. So system dynamics is models are pretty much differential equations models, and we use stocks to represent variables that don't change instantaneously, that accumulate over time. And examples, for example, population or waste that we put on a landfill, or number of people infected by coronavirus. And to make it simple, the definition of a flow is a rate of change over time. So pretty much how quickly the stock changes over time. And examples are like, for example, birds or waste disposal in the landfill or people getting infected and so on. And this is also an example of, a reinforcing loop. The more I get, the more I have, the more population we have, the more birds we get, and the more birds we get, the more population we have. And obviously this is incredibly simplified, but just to give an idea of how the nomenclature works. So I hope this is a good introduction for those of you that are not familiar with the methodology, and now we will move forward to start to build our first model. And for this first model, I am building on the work that Moorcroft is presenting in his book, a quite good book if you want to learn a bit more about system dynamics. And this is about drug-related crime. So we have this stakeholder that is talking to Professor Moorcroft and say, drugs are a big worry for me, not least because of the crimes that addicts commit to fund their dependency. We want the police to bust these rings and destroy the drugs. They say they are doing it, and they keep showing us stacks of cocaine that they have seized, but the crime problem seems to be getting worse. So you see on the bottom a graph over time. This is probably a bit exaggerated, how we see the number of crimes that have been reported. And this is, of course, what this population is willing to accept, or what is tolerable by the population. And we have this gap increasing. We have this problem building up of, well, we have more drug-related crime, and it seems that the fact that the police is cracking on catching the drug is not really helping us. So we built this small CLD to try to explain what is going on here, what we are looking at. By now you are aware of the nomenclature of CLD, so I am just going quickly go through it. So we see that we experience some drug-related crime. This calls for action from the police. The police seize the drugs, and that means that there is less supply of drugs in the street than otherwise. So let's assume that they haven't changed the input from the market. So this means that and the same amount of people still want to consume those drugs, so the price go up, and now means that the addicts need to get more money in order to fulfill their addiction. So they need to commit more crimes, and this is an explanation, and I know that it's a very simplistic explanation. We will get in more detail later on. But this is an explanation of what we have in the previous slide. And you see how, despite the fact that the police is cracking on this, you still have an increase on crime because, well, people need to get more money to buy their drugs. We transform this into a proper model. So this is a stock and flow diagram that represents the model. You can build these kind of models in using different commercial software you probably have used in the past, like GoldSim or Vensim or Stella Architect or PowerSim. So there are a variety of them. Obviously, you also, as I mentioned before, these are differential equations, so you obviously can do it in R or Python as well. But well, the diagrams in this case have been built in Stella Architect. And you see the same that we have in the previous CLD. We have the street price is driving the funds required, and that means that more people commit crimes. Those call for action from the police, and then we have the number of police seizing the drugs. This decreases the stock of drugs in the market, and this leads to an increase on the price. And if the average drug consumption, we need more funds to satisfy addiction. So I'm just quickly going to show you, for example, some of the equations. So this is the equation of that variable there. So the funds required to satisfy the addiction will be the street price multiplied by the average drug consumption. So you have pounds per year, and is the amount of money that they need every year to satisfy their addiction. And this is pounds per kilogram and how many kilograms they consume per year. Similar, for example, for how the drug-related crime, well, how much pounds can they get from committing a crime in average? How much pounds do they need? That will tell us an estimate of how many crimes they will commit. And this is regarding the supply of drugs on the street, and how you see this is a differential equation. Usually we don't use different, like we have these circular relationships. Usually what we use is numerical integration to solve the equation. So rather than see the dt's being integrated, you will see this kind of equations for a stock. And this is the result of the model. Of course, it's a very simple model, but you see that the drug-related crime is increasing as was described by the stakeholder. And this is because the street price is increasing due to the drug seizures also increasing. You might say like, oh yeah, but this is a very simplistic model and you're missing many things, and that's right. For example, the price eventually will affect the demand. You know, the higher is the price, probably some people will switch to alcohol, or they will just stop consuming drugs, or less people will get into the addiction because it is it's very expensive hobby. Also, the street price might actually make more drug dealers try to bring drugs to our community, so that might be another effect. There are also other things that we can explore. So, for example, what measures can we implement, or what actions can help us to reduce the consumption, or which actions can we implement to reduce the demand? How can we support people? What kind of education we need to provide, etc., etc. All together, how can we stop drugs coming into our community so that we don't have too much? But I can imagine this one will probably have similar effects than seizing the dogs, because both of them are affecting this stock. So this one is just a very simple example of how system dynamics works. So for those of you that were not familiar with system dynamics, hopefully this was a good enough introduction, and then we can work to a more complicated example where I would like to quickly show you how system dynamics have been used in a practical case to tackle a social problem. In this case was to explore the welfare reform in the US. So this was introduced by the Clinton administration in 1996. And pretty much what they did is they changed the way welfare was allocated and how people could access it. They introduced this temporary assistance for needy families, TANF or TANF, and this is going to be important for our model. And what is important for us to know is, well, they changed the rules of the game. What they say is families that are in need, they will provide assistance to them so that the children can be taken care of, but they will only do that for a period of 5 years. So the families have 5 years to find a good and stable job that allow them to support themselves. They introduce the mechanisms or some services that will help the people in these families to get good jobs so that they can go back on the fit. And you can see that they also have other goals for that policy, but those goals are not particularly relevant for what we will be discussing today. This work was done, started in January 1997 by Aldo Sagona, John Roper, George Richardson, and Professor David Anderson. It's a very well documented case, and that's why I choose it for today. I was thinking to share a couple of cases, but I think it's better if we focus on this one because you will be able to find, if you want, many papers that have been published regarding what happened, how did it work. I think you even can get hands-on on the model that they produce if you want to play along with it later. And what they did is that they got together with a coalition of stakeholders in New York State, and what they were trying to do is to identify what policies can help them to make of this change in policy a success. And this is what they built in very simple terms. It still already looks a bit more complex than the model that we explored before, but hopefully you will be able to follow it. You see that we have people joining the TANF program. So those that for some reason they have become eligible, they don't have a stable income and the kids are at risk. They will judge which ones, or they will see which ones qualify for the TANF and which ones no. Those ones that qualify for the TANF, they will try to get them a job. They partner with the NGOs and other organizations that will grant jobs for to these people so that they can get back on the fit. As you can imagine, some of these people might not have the right background, so if they just go to the normal job market, then might not be able to get a job. So this was to try to get them a job where they could get a good record, that they have been working for 6 months, 8 months without getting into any troubles, without being drunk. They have been able to keep a job and they have been doing well. And once that they will get there, you have some employment services that will help them to go back to the mainstream economy. And of course, there were some people that will lose their jobs for X or Y reasons. And if was within the 5 years period, they will be able to go back to these families that are receiving the benefits. If they were not in this within the 5 years period, so after 5 years, they will go to these ones that are not eligible for the benefits anymore. In this case, they would just get state support, like normal state support, to try to get them in the fit and finding a job. So obviously, this is without getting in touch with these special partners that the TANF program had. And obviously, there were some people here that they will lose their job after the 5 years, so they will go directly to be back in the queue with everybody else. There were some cases where they were allowing people to apply again for the program when kids were particularly at risk, but most of the time they will just go and will be with this families in that version where they will not have proper access to all the benefits of TANF. And what we will be focusing on in the discussion today is on these 3 stocks. So how the families were moving from here to here, so from being eligible to being in the TANF, and then to being part of the group that was already employed. And this is the model that George and David built with the guys together with them, and they show it to them. And this is a simplified representation of it. And it's just to show you how can you start to have these conversations even before getting a lot of data. And remember, this was at the inception, pretty much 1 year after they implemented this new policy. So there was not a lot of data there. And what they were trying to understand is, where should we focus our efforts? Should we focus our effort on the support capacity? Should we try to find them a first job so that they can get out of this box? Or should we focus on the second box, and should we try to find them a permanent job? Should we help them to be self-sufficient and get back on their feet so that they can so that they can move away actually from being employed by these special partners that that were helping the program. So the first policy was focusing on this, and these are the results of the model. So you see that they were, again, without too much data, they say, well, what if we have a 20% increase in the upstream capacity? So what if we focus on trying to get them into a job and we are 20% more effective? And you see that the number of families at the beginning increases, but like they are not going quickly enough out of this state of being in this first employment. They were going back to both of these boxes, and some of them actually were like they were after 5 years of being in the program, they actually have to go back to the queue and to try to be eligible. And you see that, well, there is a cap here, and it was just simply the capacity of the program, how many families they could take on. Focusing on the second one, you see it was trying to, well, we should try to get them out of the program. We should try to get them back to a normal economy and help them to be self-sufficient and to get back on the fit. And that one has better results just because you are emptying this box, so you don't have as many of these families going back to the original stages, and that was the result of the simulation. So I want to, you could find the reference here, by the way, if you want to check the paper. As I say, beside this paper in 2011, there are 2 or 3 more papers that Richardson published on that. So I think one of them even have the model, so you can play around with it by yourself. What I wanted to highlight with this example is how something very simple as this model that we can see here can still give us some insights and can be interesting to have the conversation with policymakers. I think this is where I see, particularly personally, the main strength of system dynamics for tackling social complex problems, because you can start with something very simple, very easy to grasp, without too much data, and just to start to explore scenarios and say where our policies or initiatives could be more effective. And in this case, probably these charts that you see here are not a prediction, or definitely are not a prediction of what is going to happen, but definitely give you a grasp of what mechanisms you need to be aware of when implementing these policies. For example, being aware that there is a big role that is played by the people coming back and not able to stay for long enough or to keep long enough their jobs. And also it shows that it is definitely you need to get them back to the economy and get them back to normal jobs so that you can take more families and also prevent them to go back to being at risk. So the longer they stay in the system, the worse. So the sooner we can get them out of this program and help them to be back on the fit, the better. So just to conclude, I think we have already done 75% of the time that we have today. Here are some resources, interesting resources. If you find system dynamics something that you like or that you would like to explore in more detail, the OR Society has very good resources, and they also offer some courses in system dynamics that you might be interested to take. So join the society if you haven't. There is also the UK System Dynamics chapter. There is the website that you can visit. They also have very interesting resources. A lot of it focuses on coronavirus right now, but you also can find other models and tools, and people's very friendly if you need help. Obviously, System Dynamics Society, this global society of people doing system dynamics, also have lots of resources. Some books that I will recommend you to check, probably you have here some of them, like The Fifth Discipline or Modeling the Environment from Andy Ford. Very good books if you are starting with system dynamics and if you want to know more. Well, I think this is all for me. So if we go to the questions, do we have any questions? Or I haven't been checking the chat.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you for the presentation. Yes, we do, and we'll start with them in the order as they've been voted in the Q&A section. So the first question is from Ian, and he says, Persuading stakeholders unfamiliar with systems approaches who have existing ways of thinking is difficult. Is finding a senior person who does support them the only way to get them to participate?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. As I was saying, Richardson and company, they developed this model in a participatory approach. So they invited a group of stakeholders to work with them. They think that is a very common practice in system dynamics, exactly because, as you were saying, it is very difficult for people to buy into the idea if they haven't been part of the process. How to start it is, I think, if someone would know the answer, it would be a silver bullet. I think indeed one of the ways to start is to get a senior person to sponsor the program and introduce you to the group and support the modeling effort. But I think sometimes if you start from the bottom and convince enough people and show the value of it, yeah, that might also help you to start to go up and start to convince people that are in more senior positions, especially if you do all the heavy work and you manage to synthesize the results and the insights in something very short, that a person in a senior position will be willing to spend time looking at. I think that is very worthwhile. So something very simple and very powerful to communicate, like this diagram, for example. It could be probably something that you only have at the end, but can be good to get some buy-in from senior stakeholders.
Thank you, Hugo. Just a comment on the said question. There was a comment about making sure that you would take on board as many people as possible who are involved there. And you not only have the one person supporting it, but you try to explain the approach and any policies that come out of it to the most people. And then you're able to engage the whole organization in such a way. Let us move to another question here. This one's from Bess, and she's asking, when creating the model, do you take your best intuitive guess of what's happening? There could be other reasons for drug use increasing. How do you decide? So what do you start? How do you start modeling? How do you decide what model will look like?
Yeah, very good question. So often we start by asking stakeholders what is their perception of the problem. What do you think the problem is? And as we talk at the beginning of this presentation, they usually are overconfident or biased towards a particular understanding of the world. So definitely that's why you need to involve many different stakeholders and try to capture many different views. The more and more diverse pool of people you talk to, the better. So you will get different views about what are the real causes. And I think a very interesting exercise is, once that you collected all of them, you put them in the model and you start to play the different scenarios and start to challenge which ones are to which ones the system or the results of the model are more sensitive to. And as you see which ones are more sensible to you, people might realize, oh, well, this that I thought that was the real cause is not so important. And also it is a good way to start a conversation about, well, this is what you told us, but this is what the other stakeholder told us, and it seems that that has a bigger impact. So why don't we investigate further in that direction?
Thank you, Hugo. There came another question from Stacy. The question is, what methods do you recommend to determine the amount of details to include? For example, would you use sensitivity tests to try to understand if the model needs more details?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. I don't think there is a straightforward answer. Definitely, sensitivity tests will help you to understand to which assumptions or which parameters you need to investigate further. Usually, we focus on those areas that seems to have the bigger impact. But as we say in the previous answers, this might be biased towards a particular understanding that we have of the system. My advice is usually to go big and in detail, as much detail as you can at the beginning, and then start to summarize and aggregate the model as you progress. So you will see that even when you're talking with stakeholders, they probably would like to dig into a lot of detail just because their daily job or their daily life involves those details. Some of them might be relevant, some of them not really. Some of them might be not very relevant in terms of the sensitivity of a parameter, but might be very interesting in terms of the story and will potentially suggest things that so far haven't been very important in the system, but that might be in the future. So let's say something people, I think none of us 6 months ago would have considered that having a good internet connection at home will be a critical factor for doing some of our daily tasks. And I think nowadays probably internet is even more important than having a car. So that's why it's important to consider a wider range of perspectives and start with as many elements in the model as you can manage.
Thank you, Hugo. I think you've touched on it during your presentation, but if you could reiterate. So are there any R or Python or any other open source language packages for system dynamics that you would recommend, and any other software for creating the diagrams?
Okay, well, I'm not going to recommend any software. I have my favorite one, but they don't pay me for advertising them. So I'm just going to say that you can either go for, there are plenty of them, Stella, Architect, as I say, Vensim, PowerSim. You can also use GoalSim and other analogic, other modern packages. You can do R. There is a book by Professor Jim Dugan that where he explains in more detail how to use R, and one of my colleagues and friends just released an R package that will help to build system dynamics models in R. So it already has lots of the functions that we usually use. So definitely you can use R. Python is, it's less people using Python, so probably you will encounter more troubles, but definitely R is a good alternative, and happy to share with you the contacts for those packages if you're interested.
Thank you, Hugo. Another question is, how do you decide where to place the boundary of the system model? The drug crime, for example, could be extended to include education, wealth, deprivation, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that that's one of the limitations of any model. We need to set boundaries. We need to decide what is in and what is out. In system dynamics, we will try to focus on set up the boundaries so that we capture the main internal dynamics that are relevant to all stakeholders and dynamics where people has influence on. So let's say, for example, in the drug crime case, you probably want to focus on those dynamics that are within the community, because you are talking to community, to stakeholders in this community. What can they do? How can they influence the system? Rather than focus on dynamics that are happening at a central government level or at an international level. One of the key messages of system dynamics is how can we influence the behavior of the system rather than just be victims of destiny or fate, of saying, well, this is going to happen, it's nothing we can do. So we focus on those to model, to include in the model, and other variables obviously can be included as exogenous, and you can test sensitivities to it and say, well, what will happen if central government decides to change this policy, or if this event happened in the international community, or so on and so forth. But in terms of boundaries of what you model, I would recommend you to focus on those things that your stakeholders within your organization or within your community group can actually influence on, so that they focus on what they can actually affect.
Thank you, Hugo. Another question is, what advice would you give on combining system dynamics with some of the other methods you've mentioned previously?
Okay, well, I think there are many examples in the literature, and I think it, in some methods like agent-based modeling or discrete simulation event, I think it happens quite intuitively. So if any of you is familiar with these methods, you probably recognize that you have feedback loops there anyway. They're just represented in a different way. So usually what you do is you choose which parts of the system you want to investigate in more detail. For example, in the case of agent-based modeling, you probably would like to have a more detailed population of agents deciding whether to buy drugs or not, and you can keep the other parts of the system quite aggregated at a quite high level using system dynamics. That could be an example. How can you combine them? I would say system dynamics is quite flexible to combine with other methods and allow you this flexibility of just focusing on those where you can get or need to get into more detail and leave the other parts of the system at a quite high level, quite aggregate level.
Thank you, Hugo. A question about the second poll that we've conducted, about the 4 barriers that were mentioned there. Do you have any literature supporting those 4? Are they the main ones, or any information that you give or sources that you could help out with to explore more of those barriers for the implementation?
Okay, yeah, well, those 4 were coming from a paper, I think it's this paper, if I am not mistaken. As you saw, I didn't really cover those 4 in the presentation, but I rather cover other 3. I don't think that is a very exhaustive review of the literature, so that's why I talk like it is a good. I found it a good way to start the conversation and to see what were your views. But I think there are many different barriers. These are just 4 of them that you can consider.
Thank you. Another question is, how do you validate the model and its quantitative outputs if so many aspects of the model may be subjective?
Okay, yeah, well, I obviously will not, we have like 4 minutes to go, so I will not elaborate in much detail here. System dynamics has its own procedures of how to, or process of how to validate the model. I'll be happy to share some of the papers, for example, from Barlas, describing how to validate the model, and also in the book, John Sterman spent some time talking about validating the model. I think a fundamental issue with system dynamics is that you see that we are trying to build this explanation of what is going on, and like you were saying, a lot of it is subjective. So the validation needs to be quantitative, and you need to run till statistics, and you need to check your error deviations and so on. But you also need to check that the explanation that is underlying the model, it makes sense. Otherwise, like we are operating at a quite high level, aggregated level, yeah, you might be producing the right behavior for the wrong reasons, or the right results for the wrong reasons. And so a lot of qualitative validation, bring it back to stakeholders, ask experts to challenge it and to offer different views is also important. And I think we only have 3 minutes left. So I think we would just, I would just take the rest of the questions offline. If you or Geraldine can pass them to me, Olga, I will just reply to people. Or if you want to get in touch, you can find me Twitter, and you can also drop me an email. I will be happy to continue this conversation later on. I hope that the webinar was useful for all of you, that you got something interesting out of it, and that you get excited about using system dynamics in some sort of form to address some of the issues that you are dealing with.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Thank you for the presentation. Just a reminder, the video of this webinar will be available on the OR Society, and it will be also emailed to you by Friday. We will also have a survey feedback that will be emailed to you, so please provide us some feedback with that. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you for joining, and have a great day. We'll see you in the next webinar Wednesday, organized by the OR Society.